talk about cannabis associations and social clubs, and I've come to an elegant solution and that's UN compliant. So firstly, solution to what? What is the problem? Well, I think the problem is that there is a growing consensus that the criminal prohibition of cannabis is bad for public health, bad for human rights, and national governments which are responsible are seeking a solution to this problem and looking for change, but change is tricky. Why is change tricky? Well, there is no obvious ready-made regulatory market or framework, for cannabis. There is a legacy of criminal prohibition and extensive criminal networks. And there is as well an international drug treaty framework which has to be complied with. Over the course of the last 2 decades, cannabis consumers in Spain, thousands of them, united to create cannabis associations. Cannabis associations you will probably have heard of. This is what they are. They were created by civil society, a not-for-profit association for adult members, to grow cannabis on behalf of the membership, and to provide a licensed space for its distribution and its consumption. The club, or the premises, is paid for by the revenues generated by the distribution, is the word used rather than sale, for obvious reasons, of the cannabis. Before going into the quite complicated legal context of cannabis associations, I just want to spell out what I think the advantages of the model are. Firstly, it's bottom-up created, so it's created by civil society, based on the right to association, which is an important right in a democracy. Also, it is human rights and public health friendly. Now, whilst it's wonderful to move things from the criminal sector or the justice sector to the health sector, we also have to bear in mind that it's possible to have very draconian measures in the names of public health. So we need to bear in mind the importance of respecting human rights at the same time. Most elegantly of all, it complies with the UN drug conventions. It empowers the consumers of cannabis, and the democratic structures that are inherent in a private membership body. So there are most countries who have detailed regulations for how an association has to operate. They actually provide members with the means of being able to control the product and obtain product information. The not-for-profit status of associations protects against the risks associated with commercialisation. So some of those have already been pointed out just now in the last talk. So there's a concern that for commercial reasons the product will be made stronger than the consumer might actually want. There might be an encouragement to use. And also there's an enormous regulatory burden attached to making a product legally and commercially available. So it's quite difficult for governments as well. It protects the consumer of cannabis from risks associated with the black market. Obvious ones being exposure to the sale of other, more dangerous drugs, exposure to a criminal environment, so the consumer might have to go to a dangerous place in order to acquire the cannabis, and also provides, as I said, some measures of control over the product that they're actually consuming. Also, the model facilitates research into the effects of cannabis and the effectiveness of public health measures. And it reduces the black market. I think that's a bigger point that perhaps needs to be unpacked a little bit. What are we talking about when we talk about a black market? Are we just talking about taking away the supply from countries that have produced it for many years? It's a topic that we can look into, but certainly it seems to be the perceived advantage of the cannabis clubs. But as we'll see in a moment, if you're going to achieve that, then you need to regulate the cannabis clubs to make sure that they are actually protected in law. Okay, Spanish legal context I will go through briefly. The reason it's important to mention, to understand the legal context, is firstly it explains why you might never have heard of the cannabis clubs in the same way that we've heard about the model in Portugal, for example. It didn't really make the news because it emerged very slowly within the society. Also, it's interesting that possession of drugs, so possession of cannabis, cultivation of cannabis, has never been a criminal offence in Spain. So we can talk about Portugal being radical and tolerant and how fantastic it was, or we can talk about Norway leading the way, but actually it's never been criminally punished in Spain. The other reason it's important to understand the Spanish legal context is because you might be surprised if you visit a cannabis club that it doesn't comply with everything that it should comply with if it was to be the model that it sets out to be. And that's because there is uncertainty in Spain and there are disputes between the central government and regional government and the courts as to whether or not this model is legal. That makes it very difficult to police. So whereas it's useful to go to the cannabis clubs to see there's nothing really going on there, it's just a bunch of people sitting in a bar listening to music or working on their computers whilst consuming cannabis, it might not be as strictly compliant with some of the points that I'm going to lay out today as you might expect. So cannabis clubs really were Spain's response, civil society's response to seeking to protect cannabis consumers' right to socialise with cannabis. It's based on the right to association. So the right to association, like in many democratic countries, is considered very important. It enables individuals to join together, to share their opinions, to exert pressure on government to change the way that the law is. Importantly, there are detailed regulations for how an association must be run. So it must be registered, it must have a constitution that lays out what the aims of its membership body are, and also it must have democratic structures so that the members must be able to participate in the decision making of what is a legal entity. An association has its own legal personality. So that's all very well, but what is the drug law in Spain? Domestic drug law dates back really to 1967, which is when the dictator Franco very much sought to ingratiate himself with the international community by ratifying the convention in 1961. It says in the preamble of the law, Spain doesn't have a problem with drugs, but we would like to comply with the international conventions. Very clearly stated at the outset of the law. What does the law do? Well, it says that drug conduct that is unauthorised is illicit. Drug conduct will only be authorised when it is for medical or scientific reasons. I.e., it says exactly what the UN Convention says, which is that drug consumption that is neither medical nor scientific cannot be authorised. But that's all the law did. It didn't say it would punish anyone for acting in breach of it. It just says it's not okay to take drugs for reasons that aren't medicinal or scientific. In 1971, a criminal offence is created. The criminal offence essentially says that it's very similar to what we now have: cultivate, produce, traffic, or otherwise promote, encourage, or facilitate illegal consumption of drugs, or possessing drugs with that objective is a criminal offence. When this was first introduced, a number of enthusiastic prosecutors sought to prosecute people for possession of cannabis alone. The Supreme Court, and you have to bear in mind this is the Supreme Court under the dictatorship of Franco. This is not a radical human rights loving judiciary. The judiciary looked at this case and they said, well no, possession of drugs for personal consumption is not a matter for the state. It is not a matter for the criminal law, because the objective of the criminal law is a protection of public health, not individual health. That is a matter for the individual. That was because of legal doctrine in Spain, which says that the law should seek to achieve its objective, which is limited to public health protection. This topic comes up again, whether or not possession for personal use should be criminalised. It came up after Spain ratified the 1988 Convention, and the Conservative Party very much wanted it made illegal, and the government said no, because we're going to rely on the basic concepts of our legal system, and those are that the aim of the law is protection of public health alone. So the criminal law in Spain does not punish consumption, but it punishes all activity that encourages it. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court had a number of cases come before it in which people were sharing drugs amongst themselves. And the question then was, is that supply? In lots of countries, that is supply. In the UK, for example, if you were to pass a joint to someone else, that is supply of drugs. The Supreme Court looked at this and they said, well, no, this isn't a matter of public health, once again. This is people who are already consuming drugs, sharing drugs amongst themselves. This is a matter of individual health. It doesn't concern the state. So that's quick legal context. So we go and say, how we have a cannabis social club. And this is just to explain very quickly, that's the doctrine of shared consumption that was created by the Supreme Court. So the drug taking takes place out of the public site. So drugs are not diffused amongst third parties. It's consistent with personal and occasional consumption. The collective is a small one. The joint is for immediate consumption. The basic point of the law is to ensure that the drugs do not go beyond that circle of friends. Okay, cannabis clubs, how did they come about? Well, in 1992, the government made it an administrative offence for people to consume or to possess drugs in public. This was considered outrageous by cannabis consumers in Spain. What do you mean we can't take our cannabis to friends of ours' houses and consume together? Why are you ghettoising us? It's difficult for countries where, for those of us who come from countries where people are locked up for this behaviour, perhaps to understand the outrage. But in Spain this was considered outrageous act of the government. So they join together in associations, and the associations decide, well, we're going to cultivate cannabis on behalf of our members, and we're going to consume it together socially. The courts had a look at this, and the court said, yeah, that seems perfectly legal. It is personal consumption. It's collective cultivation. Cultivation for personal use is not an offence. This is personal use. It's a closed group of people doing it on behalf of themselves. So it became big news. Thousands of associations set up. By 2015, we've got thousands of them. Some of them with several hundred members. And we then have licensed clubs, where this was partly an activist move by the lawyers assisting the associations to really push the government to come up with some regulation. So the association started applying for activity licenses. So that might be to have a table tennis in the club. It might be to have the premises that then have to comply with rules about evacuating smoke, and various other typical sort of licensing requirements. And then you ended up with bureaucracy being what it is in Spain, a special cannabis club licence. But then it became very difficult for courts or police to lock up people who have been given a licence to operate a club. We then get regional regulations, and it's become more and more regulated until the anti-drugs prosecutor basically goes ballistic and says, hang on a minute, how is a club that has 10,000 members personal use? No. And started bringing lots and lots of prosecutions to the courts, and to the fury of the prosecutor and the police, the court said, seems fine to us. Doesn't seem to affect public health, it's a matter of individual health, it's these people's their own decision, they're seeking to avoid the black market, they're growing their own, they're doing it responsibly. So the court started adding membership of criminal organisation in order to get the cases before the Supreme Court. And what we now have is we have this conflict amongst the judiciary. So is this, as some courts have said here, in the Audiencia Palmer said, okay, it's slightly different to the shared consumption doctrine. We've got more people, but why should this be an issue of numbers? This is a qualitative decision, and also, why should it be that the cannabis should be for immediate consumption? That's not very practical when you have to grow it and harvest it and store it. And so we've got then the court that issued 3 decisions in 2015, basically saying that they didn't think it would have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. It wasn't clear where the line between public health and individual health should be drawn. But the court was concerned firstly on traipsing on the terrain of the government by issuing indications that might be seen as regulation, and was also concerned that 300 people, which was the case it was dealing with, let alone 10,000, which is the case of some clubs, might be seen as a radical departure from a European conception of personal consumption. So we now have a stalemate, and that's a problem. Sorry, where I missed one there. Okay, sorry, there's a quick summary there of what the Supreme Court said. So they're a bit stuck with the line between public health and private health. So the implications of the stalemate are that all of the attempts at regulation by the municipalities are dead because no one's clear whether or not it's legal. There's no incentive now for the cannabis clubs to continue to exist to comply with good practice guidelines that have been developed. There are difficulties for law enforcement in distinguishing between what's criminal cultivation and a association cultivation. There's uncertainty for the associations and the members. There's a grey market, which is difficult for the police to determine what the source of supply for the club is, because clubs aren't, as they initially were, saying, hello, here's our crop, it's for the club, because they're now at risk of prosecution. And of course there are limitations on meaningful empirical research as to the benefits of this model, because it's in a grey area. Okay, now I want to move away from the Spanish legal context and explain how this model is transferable and why it is UN compliant and public health and human rights friendly. So let's have a quick look at the international comparative law. So international drug treaties. Only drug use that is for medical or scientific uses may be authorised. Okay? So that's why we know that Canada's model is in breach of the UN conventions because it is regulating recreational use. That's a no-no under the conventions. Okay? We can't regulate recreational drug use. It's a shame, but that's how it is. Article 3 of the 1988 Convention lists the conduct which state parties have to make a criminal offence. Essentially, it's drug trafficking. And incidentally, when the parties were negotiating what drug trafficking meant, they couldn't agree, which is why it's not defined in the treaties. Half of the state parties thought drug trafficking should just be the commercial supply, the other, and shouldn't affect individuals and individual use, and the others thought it did. So the compromise position is we ban drug trafficking, we don't define what it is, but we provide exceptions, which is that conduct which is for personal use, we have it specified in Article 3.2, and that's possession, purchase or cultivation of drugs, does not have to be a criminal offence if making it criminal would clash with the constitutional principles or the basic concepts of the country's legal system. So, in summary, trafficking must be criminal, personal consumption of drugs for medical or scientific purposes must not be authorised but does not need to be criminal. Okay, so what constitutional principles can we apply here? Well, is there a right to take drugs? Some would be outraged by the suggestion, but actually all the way back to 1972, we have courts recognising that the use of drugs comes within the right to privacy or associated personality rights, such as the right to develop one's personality, the protection of human dignity, the right to freedom of thought, that sort of thing. So that was recognised long ago, but then of course we have the environment of the war on drugs and all of the rhetoric that goes along with that, which I think made it almost impossible for anyone to try and rely on a right to cognitive liberty without being laughed out as being a crazy hippie. But things changed. We now have a series of constitutional decisions by several different countries. First we had Colombia in 1994, Argentina in 2009, Mexico first in 2015 and several decisions by the Supreme Court since, South Africa in 2017 and Georgia in 2018, all declaring that not only does drug use come within the scope of the right to privacy, but also the criminal offences against it are unconstitutional, and the governments have to come up with a new regulatory framework. Okay, so what did the Supreme Court of Mexico say? The Supreme Court of Mexico judgment is really worth reading because they very thoroughly apply the human rights framework and the proportionality analysis. Essentially, the Mexican Supreme Court said, well, what you do with your recreational activities, your hobbies, is a matter for you. It's a personal decision. And consumption of substances that affect your mental state, your sensation, or your feelings and emotions are probably the most intimate of all recreational activities, and they definitely belong within the realm of privacy, dignity, and personality rights. What you do with your mind is a matter for you and not a matter for the state. So then the court said, well, what is the aim of the legislation that criminalises drug use? And it must be a legitimate aim. And to be legitimate, it must not be a perfectionist aim, i.e. it will not be about controlling the individual. And the only harm that the Mexican Supreme Court could find was driving. It might increase the risk of accidents. So that was the legitimate aim, and then the court looked at whether or not this was necessary, whether or not there were more restrictive means, and perhaps unsurprisingly, once you look at something like this that carefully, the Supreme Court of Mexico decided that the criminalisation in order to minimise driving accidents was disproportionate, and there were other less restrictive ways of minimising this risk than criminalising all use. South Africa, High Court decision subsequently confirmed by the Constitutional Court came to a very similar decision. This case looked more at what the scientific research on the harms related to cannabis were, and the court concluded that the criminal offences were disproportionate intrusion on the right to privacy, and the government now has a limited amount of time in order to change its laws. Okay, so those are the human rights they're engaged with about the basic concepts of the legal system. 5 minutes, right? So those are, as I said, doctrine of legal goods, what's the objective of the law, and that's protection of public health, principle of minimum criminalisation, and those things were explored by the Supreme Court of Spain and its parliamentary debates. So I think we've got quite a good basis for saying that there are good grounds for not having drugs as a criminal offence for personal consumption. What does personal consumption actually mean? Does it mean just the one person? Supreme Court of Chile looked at this. Personal consumption was actually used in the statute, and the Supreme Court said personal consumption in relation to the cultivation of cannabis does not necessarily imply that the use or consumption of substance obtained from the plant must be that of one sole individual, only that it is conducted solely and exclusively by the same people who sowed the seeds, planted, etc. And it's not for the consumption of third parties. Okay, so it doesn't have to be one person, but what should it be? Well, we can say it's everything that isn't drug trafficking. That would be the most honest way of doing it from a legal point of view. If it isn't trafficking, then it isn't criminal. And anything that isn't trafficking shouldn't be a criminal offence. But the problem is no one knows what trafficking means. And that's where they've got a bit stuck. In Spain, what do we actually mean by public health? What is it down to? We can have thresholds. I don't like thresholds. They're useful if you need to tell the police that they mustn't arrest someone who's got over a certain amount. But if we're going to say that the government doesn't have a right to tell you to police individual health, then why is there a right to tell us how much we can consume a day? And also, if we go above the threshold, does that automatically make it trafficking? No, it's trafficking. What it is about the sale. We can have that it's everything that's protected by the right to privacy and associated personality rights that does not harm third parties. Might be another way. European Union has actually tried very hard to specify what does trafficking mean. It tried and it came up with one definition, but as we can see, I'm speeding through this now, that it basically doesn't apply to users who sell the drugs without the intention of making a profit. Okay, so that's what the European Commission, from having done a survey of what every other country in Europe is doing, came to the conclusion that that best reflected it. European Council couldn't agree on it, they got rid of that not-for-profit bit, they stuck with the UN Convention of Trafficking, which isn't clearly defined, and simply excluded personal consumption, defined as you want. So, why a social club? Well, social club comes back to the right to association, the right to not just smoke cannabis on your own, in the privacy of your room, but to maybe do it with friends in a club, the same way as, say, alcohol is enjoyed. Respect for private life arguably extends to a right to socialise with others, and that's explored not in the context of drug offences in Europe, but certainly in the context of other privacy cases. And there's a lot of theory on group privacy being an extension of individual privacy. There's some empirical research on the cannabis clubs, that's there. Reduces health risks for the reasons that I outlined before. And where do I want to go to? I want to jump to, if you want a cannabis club in your country, what do you need? You need possession of cannabis for personal use not to be a criminal offence. You need cultivation to not be a criminal offence. You need a broad definition of personal use. And a legal add-on that's normally present would be their financial penalties for public use, which is why you might want a private club in which people can socialise, consume cannabis, distribute it, but not encourage third parties or people who are already cannabis users to do so. What's the regulatory scope in this model? The sky's the limit, so regulators, you can have a field day. You can do whatever you want. By doing it with municipal regulations, the requirements for membership clubs, and all that I would ask is that the public health rationale does also respect human rights and is proportionate. Thank you very much.